Hi, everyone. Welcome to another amazing topic of conversation. Sad that this topic has to come, but before we go into it, I want to thank my sponsors, the Health Channel, that has partnered with Amy for free doctor consultations in telemedicine. So, Mark, welcome.
Thank you.
I know that we're having a difficult conversation in view of what happened 2 days ago and the week before, and everything that has come with gun violence. So I know you and I see very different on many things, but I really respect your opinion, and that is why I wanted you to ask some questions. So, first, why is it so hard to get some type of gun control passed as a law?
I mean, I think that there was some you had the assault weapons ban that was in place for a period of time, so that did exist. I think many states do in fact limit both the right to own, the right to carry, and so there are state limitations on it. But in terms of something passed federally by Congress, I think there's a couple of factors at play. One of them is, I think, the reluctance of gun owners and law-abiding gun owners to cede control of what they see as their Second Amendment right. I mean, if you read the Second Amendment, it says, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So an infringement would be taking, any part of taking that away. And that's really the debate is, to what extent, if any, would be constitutional to take away the rights of people to bear and keep weapons. So I think that's a real concern that law-abiding gun owners have. The other issue is, of course, the politics of it. Is there is a lot of involvement by gun lobbying groups, 2 members of Congress. So just like any issue, I think there's lobbying going on behind the scenes, and I think where there maybe in years past have been some more ability of Congress people to come to some type of agreement. I think there's a lot of pressure there on them politically to not really to get in back of any type of gun restrictions.
But I understand the Second Amendment and I understand that point of view. That is not in discussion. But background checks. Like, we have background checks on everything. We do a background checks on employees. And if you hire somebody, if you have a baby and you're going to hire a nanny, you do a background check because you're putting your kid in the hands of somebody you don't know.
So I think in most instances, background checks are happening. I know that they're happening in Florida. I think that there's a loophole from what I read. Again, I'd have to really research it, that there are some loopholes on gun shows. I don't know if that's where there are no background checks, because
there isn't. No, in
okay.
Shows there isn't, and Florida is the biggest state for gun shows.
Listen, I think it's common sense that there be some type of background check just to screen, at least for, criminal conviction or mental health issues. I'm just not sure that would really ferret out some of the bad apples. Based on what I read, and it seems like a lot of the people that are doing these horrific crimes are either stealing the weapons or they obtained them lawfully, and there would be nothing in the background check that would have stopped them. But then again, I think a reasonable background check is totally necessary, and I've subjected myself to that as a gun owner, and I don't see that as an undue burden on my right to bear arms.
But wait a second. I understand and I agree with you, but the latest shooting in the school, the kid that did it just turned 18 and bought the guns legally.
Right. So if he didn't have anything that would have been a red flag on a background check, you could have done a background check on him and he would have passed the background check. So it doesn't really solve the problem. Doesn't mean that those shouldn't be in place to potentially solve, even if you say prevent one tragedy, it might be worth it. That's the cost benefit analysis. Do you want to, you impose that burden of a background check? How much of a burden really is that? And then is it worth it? Because even if you prevent a mass shooting, it seems like it's definitely worth it.
It's definitely worth it. Because, for example, he is 18 and he's not allowed to buy a beer, but he's allowed to buy an AK-15. So
I
that's
think you're talking
part
about
of
an AR-15,
an
but
AR-15, but that is the part that doesn't make sense.
so I understand. I think that part of the discussion historically is if you're willing to send people overseas to fight in wars and to use guns at age 18 where they can go and die, the question is, you voted 18, you can serve in the military at 18. Should you be able to buy a weapon at 18?
And not have a drink legally.
I mean, those are larger questions. I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I think that you're also looking at different circumstances for different people, right? So perhaps you might suggest that raising the age to 21, for people to be at least a little bit more mature, let the brain mature, not be, a teenager anymore. What impact does that have on people who live in rural states where hunting is a way of life, as sport for food? They've been doing it for generations. What works for somebody in Wyoming is totally different for somebody in Philadelphia, type of thing. And I think that's part of the cultural disconnect that the country has. Is some people are saying, what do you mean 99% of gun owners are lawfully abiding? We've had guns for centuries. We use them for hunting. We use them for sport. It's part of our tradition. It's our constitutionally protected right. And then you have, other places that want to like ban them. I mean, even in New York City, I think it's very, very hard to get a gun, as an example. So you have those extremes, and then you have places that you could not even have to have a permit. It just, those are examples of, it's different ways of life, just the same way as in you might have a higher, speed limit in one part of the world because it's a different terrain versus another part of the world, different tradition and custom. And it's, kind of up to the states there.
But would you be okay in banning those type of military guns? Like, I understand hunting. I would put aside hunting or get a special permit for hunting.
So I think it's complicated because there's often the saying that, okay, these are weapons of war, or they're assault type weapons. The answer is any weapon could be used as an assault weapon. So if you have a handgun, you could do tremendous damage with a handgun. You could do, depending on the capacity. I mean, you can do any weapon when used by somebody in the wrong hands could do a lot of damage. So I think the concern is, who is deciding what type of weapons are you going to ban? Who is the determining person that says, okay, having 10 rounds of ammunition is the maximum, but you can't have 12? And then what happens to, I already have a gun that has 30 rounds in it, so you're going to come and take that away from me? I don't know. And I think the initial purpose of all this was the Constitution saying, okay, in order to protect, against potential tyrannical governments that the United States broke away from, you want the people to have the ability to protect themselves. At the same time, what is a reasonable restriction? Just because there's the constitutional right to have what I believe is a very clear constitutional right to keep and bear arms. I think it's crystal clear. You also have the right to free speech, but at a certain point, my right to free speech ends. I can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. I can't incite directly to violence without a penalty. So the question is, could we, when you say gun control, I would say that the majority of people favor some type of restriction on their liberty. So the majority of gun owners probably would do the same thing. They would probably say that, maybe a reasonable background check. Maybe most people would say you have to wait, a day or 3 days or something just to, make a cooling off period. Reasonable restrictions like that. The question is, when you get legislation into the hands of, for the really like liberal Democrats or people who want to really restrict it, they might say, okay, I'm from New York, I'm from Philadelphia, I'm from California. This is what I think. And I think is no guns allowed, or only 8 rounds. And I mean, if you look at a state like Connecticut, for example, from what I remember, you can only have maximum of 10 rounds in your firearm. They view that as a reasonable restriction. Other people might say that's too far. And then governmental tyranny, you're taking away all of our weapons, which is the whole point of us having weapons to protect from the government. And then there's tyranny. That's the argument. So, in my personal opinion, I think it's very nuanced. I favor certain restrictions. The question is to what extent and who determines how far those restrictions go, how difficult they become. Do they confiscate existing weapons? Do they make a ban from here going forward? It's tough.
No, I get it that it's tough because we totally believe very different things. For me, I would ban totally guns and
Well, then
just get
how
a
do you deal with
permit.
this? How do you deal with the Second Amendment that says to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed? You would do a constitutional amendment to change the Constitution? I mean,
Yes, but it depends on what kind, because you can also talk about defending myself and having real mass destruction. Uh,
right, like a cannon or a tank.
Correct.
Right.
So that is also defending myself.
Yes.
So up to what point do you really defend
Correct.
yourself and bear arms?
Correct. It's a good
Because
point. There are restrictions. I can't own a grenade launcher, you know.
correct.
And for example, when it comes to guns, it's illegal for civilians to I can't own an automatic gun. The difference is an automatic gun, you press the trigger, and if it's set to a certain setting, it'll spray, as opposed to what these guns are semi-automatic, most of them, where you have to, for each round, you need to pull the trigger. So there already is that restriction.
And there is already those seconds that somebody can interfere if you're doing something wrong.
Yes, in theory, yes. I
But
mean,
there isn't restrictions. Look at the kid. He bought one of those.
right. But what I'm saying is the difference is, so for example, from what I understand, and I haven't read all the details, it's horrific, but I haven't seen the methods that he used. But my understanding is that he had 2 rifles, something like that. But what the weapons that he's using, from my understanding, they're semi-automatic, meaning he has to pull the trigger every time to discharge a round from the gun. So it's not the ability like an automatic weapon where he could pull the trigger and it could, for lack of a better word, spray bullets. He has to pull every single time. So that already is a restriction of itself. But yes, those are still very dangerous weapons, and in the wrong hands, that's a big problem.
Let me read to you a little statistic. In 2017, the Americans were 4% of the global population, with 326 million people. And there were 393 million guns globally. That means that 46% of the global stock of guns are owned by Americans. I think it's a ridiculous amount with everything that we're seeing.
I mean, I think that America has a unique gun culture. I'm not sure about other countries, but it is encoded in the Constitution, the right to bear arms. I think that there's a lot of people that have, and a lot of people that I know, they have multiple guns for sport, for hobby, for hunting, anything of that. The question is, what percentage of those people are using them for illicit means? I would say very, very few. So yes, we're awash in guns in this country. If there's more guns than more people, there's a lot of guns out there. My speculation is if there were fewer guns, there would probably be fewer mass events like this, just because that there's not as much access to it. That's probably true.
So with that said, in 2019, when they were talking about that the gun violence was triggered by the people playing violent video games and all the violence that comes with video games, right? And the mental health, and they were linked to that. So in 2019, they did a study, and Japan is one of the first countries addicted to video games. because of their culture, they're totally addicted to video games. And but they do have a very strict policy on guns. So in 2019, there were 4 deaths with guns versus 19,384 in the US. So that goes to show that if there is a real restriction and gun control, we could save. We could have saved in 2019 19,000 lives.
Great. I think that overall, yeah, as I stated, it's probably true that if there were fewer guns, there would probably be fewer shootings just because it would be much harder to access. That's probably true. The question is at what cost? I'm not sure if, Japan has the same type of history. When you look at American history, as I said to you earlier, we're founded upon breaking away from a tyrannical government. There's increased political polarization in the United States right now. So we're becoming a more violent society. People don't trust one another. There's a lack of cohesion. I think it makes people afraid when you talk about taking away the guns because they see it as a government grab. At the end of the day, who's going to have all the guns? Let's say you banned guns or you severely restricted guns. So you have the government with all the guns and people are afraid. The next step is, what am I going to do if the government tries to take away my liberty or restrict my liberty? I have no means to defend myself and my family.
But
So it's
will
all.
you defend yourself with guns or in a legal way? And you're a lawyer.
Well, look, the question is,
That was
what if, for
200
example,
years
okay,
ago.
but I know, okay. So the question is, to what degree do you adapt with the times? The Constitution couldn't have predicted a country of 350 million or 400 million people, however we are. They couldn't have predicted the technology of, an AR-15 with 30 or 50 round capacity, something like that. Back then they were shooting rifles, one bullet at a time. The technology was much more primitive. The question is, who decides? Should this be something that the Congress is pushing? Is that subject to review of the courts? Because it's just like any other constitutionally protected right. It's the cost benefit. How much do we restrict? Even if you restrict, there would still be shootings. Even if you impose gun control, it's not going to make all the shootings go away. But you make the argument there would be far fewer, and you would save lives. It's a legitimate argument. It's just the matter of who decides and what type of restrictions do we have. Do you have to register everything? As people are afraid, everything's registered. The government knows what I have, where I live. It's, in my view,
you have a cell phone.
Listen, I think that most people would agree, the vast majority, that sensible reforms and sensible legislation that would infringe to a degree on the right makes sense. It makes sense.
Okay, I'm glad that we agree on that. The governor of Florida is now proposing open carry with no background checks, no nothing. Do you agree with that?
I'm not familiar. I don't know what specifically. I've been busy, but I don't know specifically what they're proposing. I think open carry is a little bit scary for me. And again, I'm not in law enforcement, but I'd like to hear what law enforcement would have to say about that. Just as a layperson, I think it's a little bit, it would be a little bit scary for me and uncomfortable just to be walking into environments where people are touting, firearms on their hip, or I don't know if he's allowing long guns. I'm not sure what the proposed legislation is, but I don't want to live in that type of really total open situation where, I saw some of the footage where I think other states have it, maybe in Michigan when they were at the Capitol with those long guns. To me, that struck me as a little bit barbaric and a little bit out of place in modern society. That's just my personal opinion. But again, I don't know what he's proposing in Florida.
But wait a second, Mike. As a gun owner, you're threatened. Let's put a scenario. You're threatened, somebody comes to your house, you feel threatened, you take your gun. At that point, you need to be ready to kill someone.
Yes.
And that's what I'm saying. If there are less guns, there wouldn't be more deaths. Because at least if somebody comes into your home, you can negotiate. Don't do anything, rob me, I'll do whatever you want. But at that point, it's either you or him who's dead.
I mean, I don't believe in negotiating with anybody who comes to my house.
Well, how something, okay.
If someone's willing to break into your house, that means that they're a violent person, that they have a bad agenda, and I'd rather be able to stop that lethally if necessary as a last resort. Absolutely, God forbid it should ever happen. But I think that's why people should be allowed to have deadly force. No negotiating with someone who breaks into your house.
So with, you just spoke about the legal right, the Constitution, and the whole thing. So I don't understand why is it so hard to do to control the fact that yes, you have the right to defend yourself, but on the other hand, and I don't want to go into this because I know this is another topic and we are not getting into that, but you are now controlling a woman's right to choose. So it's like, okay, let's defend. It doesn't matter if some children are dead because we do not have any controls in place. But on the other hand, you're controlling if a woman decides not to have an unborn children. So I think it's a very completely opposite situation. I think it's the same, sorry, it's the same situation with a very opposite outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to how much the government, what your personal belief is, and how much the government should be able to restrict individual decision making and an individual choice. To what degree does your decision affect others in society? To what degree does the government's ability to restrict impinge on your personal freedom? So again, you can make the argument with guns. Okay, I should be allowed, maybe you can make the argument, I should be allowed to have a weapon, but my weapon should only have 15 rounds of ammunition in it, because anymore we have a society determined that the evidence shows in whatever amount of massacres, the ability to have limited ammunition would give time for people to run away so that the killer would be able to reload, during that time, or you could do less damage. I mean, that's a legitimate argument. The same thing about the abortion situation. Could you say, okay, there are people who believe that abortion begins at conception and that you're actually murdering a child? So if that's your opinion, I understand why you would restrict abortion. Other people would say the science shows that, okay, it's not viable until X amount of weeks. So we believe that it's not a human being until X amount of weeks when it's scientifically viable. At that point, we'd restrict, because I think everybody would restrict, if it comes out of the womb and murdering the baby as a live human being. So the question is, how far back are you willing to take it? Who determines that? What's the science? Is it state by state? Is there a constitutional right, which I think that we just saw the leak, it'll probably get overturned. At that point, it'll probably go back to the states. Again, speculation. The question is, how much restriction do you want to have? How does my individual choice impact someone else? And who says, okay, that's enough restriction? And even if I'm uncomfortable with something, is it still okay for someone else to do it, because the chances of it impacting me are very low? So those are, the kind of, it's nuanced, but I see what you're saying, that there is a potential inconsistency on the two issues, but I think that they're both topics that deserve their own merit and individual consideration.
But for example, in that one, they didn't even put a line on rape and incest.
There are people who believe that no matter how you get pregnant, that's a human being. And even if it's a product of rape or incest, it's still a human being and it's murder. I'm not saying that I agree with that, but I understand what their argument is. Their argument is, just because someone, I mean, it's still a person. That's what they're saying.
Okay, so would you be okay, for example, with certain restrictions on gun control and background checks? Like you just said, it was very scary when you saw the long guns in Michigan. So can you
Yeah, so
imagine?
certain restrictions, yes. In my personal opinion, I think that, you know, all with all things being considered, I think that there should be certain restrictions, such as I think it's a little bit for most locations, especially densely populated, urban areas. I think it may be inappropriate as a modern society to allow open carry long guns, for example. Yes, I think that I think that there are prohibitions on where you can carry weapons. You can't take a weapon into an airport, in your hand luggage. It has to be checked. It's a reasonable restriction.
Yes.
I think you can't take it into a courthouse. I think it's a reasonable restriction. I mean, there are restrictions in place, and I think that there could be some others that are added that I think are very reasonable.
But for example, with the background check, the Parkland shooting, it would have immediately shown a red flag if they had done it because of the
Nicholas
instances.
Cruz, yeah.
Yeah, because of the instances. So a lot of the kids would still be alive if that was in place.
Yeah, the other thing to remember is that part of being a gun owner is the responsibility of how you manage your weapons. So, for example, I think a lot of these shooters are either stealing the weapons or they're taking them from within the own house. So either a parent, a grandparent, or aunt and uncle has it. You have to lock away. I mean, responsible gun owners know that you have to keep things safe under lock and key, out of reach of children, all that stuff. That goes along with the responsibility. So I'm not quite sure how all these shooters end up just acquiring these
It's an
weapons.
accident, like all the kids that find the gun
Yeah, it's very
outside, that is the
scary. It's
responsibility of the person that didn't lock it. I
yes.
understand that. But the shooting 2 days ago in Texas, he went and bought them, legally bought them. It wasn't that his parents had it. On the contrary, he shot his grandmother.
Right. So I guess the restrictions that you're proposing, at least that what I heard you say, the first one would be maybe to raise the age to 21.
That's number one.
Maybe he wouldn't have been able to buy it in the first
Correct.
place. Maybe he asks a friend or relative to buy it for him, but at least that's another step in deterring him. It's another loop that he'd have to go through.
Because somebody else knows that he's buying a gun.
Yes, or maybe you say that someone has to wait a day or 2 days or 3 days before they get it, so that you're not buying something while you're potentially hot-headed and angry and in the moment. Maybe that's a reasonable restriction. I don't think that's so unreasonable if it's written the right way, and I mean, I don't think that's so unreasonable.
And also, I would do it the other way around. I would restrict gun control and then do the permit. Like if you're hunting, if you're security, or if you want to apply for a gun, that's it. You apply for a gun because of security, but you apply for it like a permit. That's what I
So
would do
in
personally.
Florida right now, the current law, based on my understanding, is that you need to have a concealed carry permit. It's actually a concealed weapons permit. So you carry other weapons besides a gun. But you need to apply for that permit. You need to take a class. That's how the majority of people, and that's how you're supposed to legally carry, is with that permit card.
But carry all the time. But for example, if you buy a gun and keep it in your house, do you
Right.
need a permit?
I don't believe so.
Okay, so that's where I go. That if you want to carry, then you have to take a permit. So there is a control on the permit. Okay, you went crazy, you had the permit, something snapped, something happened.
Yeah, I think, listen, I don't know how much of this is alarmist thinking or how much is based in reality, but I've read some of the right wing arguments where they say, okay, I'm married and my wife falsely accuses me of domestic violence, and then the cops come and take away my gun and I've done nothing wrong. I mean, I think they
But
make
that's
that
like
argument.
going overboard. Look at the Johnny Depp case now.
I haven't followed.
Okay, that it turned completely. He's suing for defamation, and actually he was very violent. So it's like it's your word against the other person.
Right.
Yep. But Mark, thank you so,
Thank
so
you.
much. This
So
was
nice.
very enlightening. Even I was hoping, I was actually very happy that we agree on something.
I think we agree on, I think most people agree on most things, this issue in particular.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot more overlap than people realize. I think that most Americans would agree that there is a constitutionally protected right to bear arms, but that reasonable restrictions, just like any other constitutionally protected right, um, we could agree on that if everybody got together and sat down and exchanged ideas.
Would you agree to have that as a question in a ballot for the American people to
I mean,
decide?
I think that it's already decided. There's already a right to own guns. There's a right to bear arms. So I think
But it's a right to bear arms under the Constitution.
yes.
So it would have to be rephrased differently if it goes through the ballot.
Well, the thing is, the only way there is no the way that it would have to be changed would either be through constitutional amendment or state restrictions or congressional law. So I think that having that type of language on a ballot would be really long. And the difficulty is you get all special interest groups in, and you have left wing ideologues who want to ban guns completely, and you have people who are in the pocket of the gun companies who want no restrictions, and getting them in a room together to try to hammer out legislation is probably very, very difficult.
Okay, so definitely
So
we're not going to save the world.
I'm not so optimistic.
But with that, thank you so much.
Thank you, Gladys.
My prayers go to all the families that once again have gone through another tragedy, and above all, stay safe.
You
Thank
too.
you.
Take care. Thank you.